Thank you to Captain Robert Wood of the U.S. Air Force and Captain Joe Idson of the skipper of the USS Lane Victory, who both gave service in World War II, and I'm proud to call my friends. I have very fond memories of the USS Lane Victory. 2 decades ago, I was a volunteer on this ship and chipped and painted my days away as a volunteer. And then years later, I sailed the ship with Captain Joe Idson on tour around Catalina Island with wonderful cruises that the vessel gives to the local American citizens. I also have very fond memories of this town, San Pedro, where my first 2 children were born. The oldest one served in Afghanistan in the U.S. Navy, and my daughter served in the Air Force in Iraq, carrying on a tradition of my Sullivan family, who have been involved in America's wars for the history of our country, dating back to John Sullivan, General John Sullivan, who was involved in the Revolution era up in New Hampshire. The Port of San Pedro is very historic because it was the home and it was the founding of the National Maritime Union in America. The National Maritime Union was referred to on the waterfront as the N-word, the Mexicans, and the undesirables. That is because 8 years before the U.S. Navy racially integrated ships, the NMU integrated merchant ships and led the way for America to racially integrate vessels. I served as a deck delegate on every ship I was on and settled the beast between the white officers and the minority crew. And this town, San Pedro, is the port that I sailed around the world and circumnavigated the earth 3 times. So it has very fond memories. We are particularly proud, the members of the National Maritime Union, to call the Reverend Martin Luther King our chaplain many years ago before he was famous. Dr. King was our chaplain in our union to the men on the docks and in the union halls. And we are very proud, to be a historic note, that we raised $34,000 in union dues to bail Dr. Martin Luther King out of jail in the heyday of the Civil Rights Movement. The National Maritime Union, ironically, was very instrumental in creating a group called the Reagan Democrats that elected Ronald Reagan president. And in return for that support, Ronald Reagan awarded the Merchant Marine veterans veteran status after we had lobbied the U.S. Congress for 43 years. Reagan had the vision to assign the Merchant Marine, who incurred the highest casualty rate in World War II per capita of service. He finally awarded those worthy veterans veteran status after a long 43 years in American history. I would like to mention that the captain of this ship, Joe Idson, and I had a very mutual friend, Captain Arthur Moore. Captain Arthur Moore was the author of the Bible to the Merchant Marine, A Careless Word, a Needless Sinking. This book is the definitive book that lists all of the Merchant Marine casualties in World War II, the significant volume of them being on the Murmansk run, keeping democracy's lifeline open to North Russia. The unique story behind this book is that when Captain Arthur Moore from Maine got out of World War II, he learned from the U.S. War Department that they didn't keep accurate records of the Merchant Marine deaths nor the ships that sunk. So Citizen Captain Moore compiled as his duty, he felt his personal duty as a citizen, to compile for history the record of the Merchant Marine casualties in World War II. Captain Moore is one of the three inspirations of my book, Daddy's Not Coming Home, that Captain Wood had introduced. My book identifies three inspirations, three great Americans. Captain Moore, for having wrote the definitive book on the Merchant Marine, inspired me, and also the man who gave me life, my father, Bosun Ed Sullivan Sr., U.S. Naval Armed Guard in Murmansk. He spent a year frozen in the port of Murmansk and defended Russia on Russian soil against the Nazi onslaught. And he lost his hearing and couldn't hear the cries of his 10 children and the cries of his 6 daughters. And he passed on a great legacy to us and was honored for taking over, on top of his gun duties on the deck, the cook's job in the kitchen. And that day that he took over the kitchen, he declared that there was no more wasted food on the USS Francis Scott Key. And every single night under armed guard, my dad led a group of US Navy personnel down onto the village of Murmansk and gave out to the grandmothers and the children the food, the scraps, the leftovers, whatever he could muster because of severe famine in Murmansk. The third gentleman that I'd like to introduce is a very, very unique story. The most famous U.S. merchant marine in World War II, Captain Charlie McGilvery. A man who sailed into the port of Boston and watched a torpedo skid by the stern of his Liberty ship, and he ran down the South Boston waterfront and joined the U.S. Army. And as fate would have it, Sergeant Charlie McGilvery had a date with destiny at the Battle of the Bulge. His assignment entailed being scout, and when his Lieutenant Dan got his head blown off by a German sniper after his company being bogged down in snow in Argonne Forest in France in December of 1945, after having liberated France, Sergeant Charlie McGilvery became in command of his platoon because his lieutenant was killed and Charlie declared, "I'm in charge." Sergeant Charlie McGilvery told his men to cover him. They had laid in the snow on their bellies for a week, and Charlie ran up that hill and dispatched all 36 Nazi Germans by himself, single-handedly. One of the most bravest single-handed acts in combat in World War II. And the very last German turned his machine gun and shot Charlie's left hand off. I knew him my whole life in Boston. He tended bar with an axe handle. And my Congressman John Joseph Moakley, who appointed me to the World War II Memorial Committee, his dad owned bar rooms that Charlie received all of his friends. And it's so ironic that I drove with this book up to Hallowell, Maine, to have the author, Captain Moore, sign it for Charlie McGilvery. We were doing a fundraiser to build the World War II Memorial, and I had all my Merchant Marine veterans at Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts sign the book. And when I put the book in Charlie's left shoulder to take a picture with the duty nurse at the VA hospital, it fell on the floor, and Charlie said, "My God, they had to make a book so big on those Merchant Marine who gave the ultimate sacrifice that it's too big to hold on to." And that picture in my book is memorialized because when I left Charlie McGilvery's hospital room, Charlie McGilvery, with this Bible to the Merchant Marine, died with it on his nightstand. And he's my third inspiration for my book. It's Captain Moore who compiled the facts on why we announced today a mission of respect to honor our fallen Merchant Marine who kept the lifeline of democracy open to North Russia. Our American mission of respect to Russia during Christmas of 2016 will honor and pray for our patriotic American merchant marine, the fallen heroes in Murmansk, and our Russian allies in St. Petersburg at Piskiu Cemetery. All of Americans were informed through the power of the internet 2 years ago by Merchant Marine veteran Oliver Stone and Professor Peter Kuznick of American University of the results of their research that millions of more Russians had died and were buried in St. Petersburg than our history books recorded. Our brave who gave the eternal sacrifice during the greatest battle against evil in the history of the world during the blockade of Leningrad. My father, the U.S. Naval Armed Guard, who was frozen in Murmansk and who sacrificed and who had lost his hearing, was defending Russia on Russian soil because he thought it was a worthy cause to risk his life against the most evil force ever assembled in the world. I had the honor to be summoned to the new federal courthouse in Boston, Massachusetts by Congressman Joe Moakley. It was a very intimidating meeting for me, my chairman of the National World War II Memorial Committee of Massachusetts, because the courthouse that he sat in was named in his honor while he was still alive. That honor was bestowed by President George W. Bush. When I sat with Congressman Moakley, he took out a tiny scrap of paper, and with a short little stubby pencil, he wrote down 3 names for me to go and invite to his table of honor at the World War II Memorial fundraiser at Joe Teshi's restaurant, where we raised nearly $2 million. I obeyed my orders from Congressman Moakley, and have already shared with you that I went and visited Sergeant Charlie McGilvery at the top of his list. I invited Charlie to his table of honor. Charlie yelled for the duty nurse to order the Ancient and Honorable's driver to be ready for the event and asked the nurse to iron his Army uniform. On that list was also Captain George Street, who I went and visited in the Andover nursing home shortly after meeting with Charlie. Captain Street, the hero submarine commander in the Pacific, who took out a whole fleet of Japanese in a port in Korea, thanked me for my service on the World War II Memorial Committee. And the next day, when I came home, when I opened the newspaper, he had passed away. I was very distraught. I called Congressman Moakley and in very strong language told him never to give me a piece of paper with great American heroes' names on it. And he laughed and said, "Why?" And I said, "Because Charlie McGilvery died the very next day and Captain George Street died the very next day." And Congressman Joe Moakley paused and he said, "Well, Sully, you're not going to be invited over to the house anytime soon." Congressman Moakley had a unique way to relieve the tension and the frustration I was feeling, because these World War II veterans were dying at a clip of 1,000 a day in America while we were actively preparing and fundraising to build the World War II Memorial in Washington. And so, shortly after reporting to Congressman Joe Moakley, our chairman emeritus of the Massachusetts World War II Memorial Committee, Joe Moakley himself passed away. And Captain Tom Hudner, a Congressional Medal of Honor winner in our committee from the Korean conflict, summarized it best for me when he said that my gift of being a volunteer to the World War II Memorial Committee was the honor to say goodbye to these great Americans. So today we hope to keep our promise to remember the sacrifice of the merchant marine who kept the lifeline of democracy open to North Russia. We hope to raise awareness to our millennial generation about our merchant marine and Russian allies sacrificing to preserve freedom and the way of life that they enjoy today. Through the exchange of our Russian and American Judeo-Christian values in prayer, we hope to put the thought of Christ back in a Christmas, and with our prayers in St. Petersburg, Russia on Christmas Eve 2016, we hope to impress upon the Russian people our sincerity of optimism in America today in regards to our relations with the Russians. We have a foundation in the sacrifice of our great patriots on Russian soil and in Murmansk by the Americans as a down payment on commerce and prosperity that our countries should be exchanging. We are inspired here in America with the election of the new president, Donald Trump, who surprised the whole world with his victory. He showed all of America by example the power to stand up for our rights and our convictions. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, most people agree that through his force of will, he exhibited the hard work and determination that can pay off in America. With that hope and optimism from President-elect Trump, we're off to Russia with the mission of respect and hope for peace and prosperity with our Russian allies from the great patriotic war of World War II. In closing, I recall the analogy that Russian President Khrushchev shared with President Kennedy when they were on the brink of nuclear war. He said, "It's like we're all in Noah's Ark, and we must learn to get along to survive in the nuclear era." Kennedy had a difficult time in Russian negotiations for peace through the Cuban Missile Crisis. He replied to Khrushchev that he liked his analogy, and he worked out a period of peace with Khrushchev shortly before he died. I'd like to share an appropriate quote for our merchant marines and our Russian allies that President Kennedy said at the U.S. Cup races in Newport, Rhode Island, a few months before his final journey to Dallas. John F. Kennedy said on that day, looking out over all the sailboats in Newport Harbor, "All of us have the same percentage of salt in our blood, in our sweat, and in our tears. And when we go back to the sea, we go back whence we came." So thank you, folks, on the USS Lane Victory. And now it's on to St. Petersburg with inspiration from our new president-elect, Donald Trump, and undertake the forgotten task to honor our fallen American merchant marine and Russian allies. Thank you very much.